So for those unfamiliar with how hotels work, it's generally 3 8-hour shifts. I work the overnight shift, the graveyard. I've been here for nearly 6 years now, and will tell you the same thing I tell new hires. I've seen some shit. Some weird and wild shit. A good rule of thumb is when something weird happens, keep your head down and leave it alone. This, of course, leads each of us to have stories to tell. Now, before you start thinking of a creepy old haunted hotel, I want to dispel that. I work for one of the biggest names in the world, in a relatively new hotel. It's about 15 years old, and not haunted. Probably. I suppose dumping one of the best stories first is the best way to go. So, the 13th floor it is. So way back when I was in training, 2 days to make sure you understand how to click a few buttons, was the first time that I had heard about it. You're gonna want to stay off the 13th floor, bro. My trainer, a guy in his 30s, Derek, who looked like he survived solely on energy drinks, had told me. I, of course, looked at him like he was the biggest idiot alive. But he stared back at me stoically. I may not remember jack shit from training, but I'll never forget the seriousness in that look. See, the thing is, my hotel has 3 floors, not counting the 13th. I brushed it off at the time as nonsense, not yet being experienced in the hotel's weirdness. Derek just shrugged and went about his explanation. Take the elevator, he said. The elevator never lands on the 13th. The stairs will, though. Sometimes if you're going up, sometimes if you're going down. He finished, handing me a bundle of receipts. We offer an express checkout where we slip your receipt under the door so you can bounce at your own convenience. Derek never brought up the 13th floor or any of the other weird occurrences. Though, it would have been nice for him to warn me about the vending machine at the end of the hall. In any case, after training, I never saw him again. I heard he moved to Alaska or something. Since then, I've been completely on my own 5 nights a week. Save for when I myself get a new little bird to teach. They usually don't last too long. I remember it was my first week alone, when my first 13th floor related incident occurred. Nothing dramatic or anything. I had heard the sound of rubbing metal followed by a wet plop sound. I had been fucking around with the sketch at the front desk when this happened. I recognized the sound immediately as the laundry chute. Problem was, it was 3 in the morning, and housekeeping had locked the chutes hours before I had even arrived 4 hours before. Our front desk is connected to the laundry room, so with my curiosity aroused, I stepped around the wall where I could see the chute opening. Laying there, half pouring over the edge like a lolling tongue with a large towel covered in some brown stains. Could have been blood, could have been shit, could have been any number of things. People are generally disgusting. I turned and brought my eyes to the computer monitor that had housed the camera feeds. 9 smaller screens embedded in a large one. Recording kicks in if they spot any movement, and I have to admit I wasn't surprised to see none were recording. Now this was, like I said, almost 6 years ago, so I can't remember for sure what I did, but knowing me, I probably ignored it. A not my job attitude. I know, it sounds dickish, but they don't pay me that much. I do remember checking the back a few hours later, only to find the towel had vanished. Again, I kept to myself. I thought maybe my brain was adapting to night shift and was fucking with me. I don't drink energy drinks or coffee, so staying awake was a battle of sheer will back in those days. That was the first time that it happened. It has happened many, many times since then, and not always a towel, oh no. It happens a few times a week at least. Some of my favorite items to come down have been a dog leash, eyeglasses, and get this, a full chess set, one piece at a time. Those are a few of the interesting trinkets. Most of the time it's hotel stuff. Towels, blankets, pillows. Sometimes they have the brown stains, sometimes a bright red coat that most definitely is blood. They always disappear without a trace after a few hours of sitting there. So, that's the laundry chute. One of the few 13th floor events. Another is the camera system. We have 3 set up on each floor. Row 1 covers the first floor, pool area, and front desk. I can always look up and get a reminder that my boss doesn't completely trust me with the $300 in the drawer. Row 2 shows, well, floor 2 and the stairwell. Row 3 shows the same for the 3rd floor. This is what is shown 99% of the time, but on the rare occasion all 9 will switch to static for a second and clear to show a darker hallway lit only by faint lights at each end. Every door on this floor stands wide open. I've never been able to make out anything else due to the awful lighting and even worse quality of the cameras. They switch back after exactly 2 seconds anyways. Another thing that happens much less often is a phone call. The ringer says it's coming from within the hotel, but the room ID stays completely blank. I don't answer these anymore, but I did before. It was always the same. An old man apparently residing in room 1302, which we of course do not have, croaking out that he can't get the weird guy off the TV, and asking if I could come and fix it for him. He would then do a baby doll giggle and hang up. It was my second year that I actually managed to land on the 13th floor, which is not nearly easy. That year, I happened to be on a fitness kick and had opted to take the stairs instead of the elevator. I know what you're all thinking, but Derek's warning had been 2 years prior, and the weirdness of this hotel had become so routine that I honestly didn't even think about what he had said about the stairs. Not to mention that I had been taking them for months without incident up to this point. I had finished delivering receipts on the 3rd floor and began my descent. I arrived at the ground floor, pushed open the door to reveal a darkened hallway resembling the 2nd and 3rd floor. Except instead of our shitty floral pattern wallpaper, the walls were lined with newspaper. It was too dark and I was too confused to attempt to read what they said. I turned around only to see that the door previously leading to the stairs now only mirrored the dark hallway. Nervously, I slowly took steps toward the center, where the elevator was located. I could hear a constant sound of wind rushing through the entire floor, but felt nothing as I reached out to press the down arrow. It lit up after my input, but simultaneously I heard every door, infinite doors, creaking open. I felt the wind now licking my face as if I stood atop a skyscraper. I turned and glared into the room directly across the elevator, pressing my back into the cold metal door. Inside, I saw that the window was open, curtains that didn't match my hotel's brand billowing in the strong wind lit by the glow of the TV. The man on the TV stared back at me, and I saw that he was no man at all, but rather a wooden puppet. His square jaw and lipless mouth seemed to have a permanent, sinister smile fixed on it. His black eyes, lifeless, rolled to the left side of its face to make up to the angle the television was sitting at. His red swirly hair, freckles, the suit he wore, and the desk he was sat upon reminded me of a twisted, demented puppet version of Conan O'Brien. He darted his eyes to the bed in the center of the room as if to say, "Hey, look at this!" before returning his gaze to me and rapidly raising and lowering his wooden eyebrows. On the bed, under the blanket, I could see a lump vaguely shaped like a human, and to make matters worse, it was beginning to stir. Just as the thing in the bed sat upright, the blanket still covering it completely, the elevator pinged and I stumbled backward into it. I flailed my hand to the button reading 1 and I pressed that fucker at least 10 million times. Just as the elevator door was closing, I gave the puppet one more look. He shot me a wink just as a huge humanoid silhouette stepped into the doorframe. I couldn't see more as the elevator had fully closed a nanosecond later and began a descent that took so much longer than it ever had. I fully expected it to open back up onto the 13th floor where that thing would grab me, but it didn't. I finally reached the 1st floor, and it was the same 1st floor it had always been. I've made it absolutely crucial that I take the elevator every single time that I have to go upstairs now. That's the story of the 13th floor. We occasionally have guests disappear. Their stuff still in their rooms when checkout time comes. I think all the employees know, we just don't talk about it. So it feels good to get this off my chest. I may be back to share some of the other weird things that go on here, but I'm gonna go for now though. Something just came down the chute, and it sounded big. A heavy darkness closed in around her, and with it came the oppressive stagnant air and thick humidity typical of a balmy summer night in Virginia. It was the sort of night that clung to your skin with the sticky determination of a lonely ex-boyfriend. Mosquitoes clouded the air, leaving their mark on her flesh as they sang their pitchy tune in her ears. Over the whine of the mosquitoes rang the cacophony of summer wildlife, eerie night sounds that dogged her every step as she trudged through the dry grass along the crumbling asphalt of State Route 619. She was raised a country girl, but her temperament toward nature leaned more toward the taste of a New York City dweller. She had never cared for the woods, especially after dark. The mere thought made her notably uncomfortable, and yet, here she was, stranded on a remote country road at night, alone. She shivered, despite the late summer heat, as she peered into the darkness with longing, desperate for any hint of headlights. A fellow traveler on this desolate stretch of night road. She strained her ears against the deafening rattle of cicadas, listening for the sound of a revving engine in the distance, but she knew she'd be better off walking the 10 miles back to town than climbing into a car with the sort of riffraff who drove this road this ungodly hour at night. She had left her car on the shoulder nearly 30 minutes prior, a white plastic bag hanging from the antenna, and a hastily scribbled note on the windshield saying something along the lines of, "Broke down, we'll be back for this piece of shit in the morning." Although she would not have been heartbroken should it be towed to some backlot junkyard to crumble and decay. She wouldn't miss it. She told herself she'd be grateful to be rid of it. In her pocket, her phone chirped. It was a single frantic staccato, a final plea for a charger as the last of its battery life drained away. It didn't matter anyhow. There was no hope of signal out here. This was it, she thought. This was how her short, pointless life would end, at the hands of some deep woods, swamp-dwelling cannibal in backroad Virginia. Not exactly the off-the-beaten-path road trip she had in mind. In reality, she half expected to unwittingly stumble across an old rusted pickup parked alongside the swamp, lights off and engine cut, as the shifty-eyed owner rolled the nondescript duffel bag containing his latest victim into the dark, stagnant water. She shivered again. Now that's enough of that. She was just being dramatic. Of course, she would be fine. After all, this was the country. Of all the places for her to be stranded, this was probably one of the safest. It was certainly a hell of a lot safer than the inner-city neighborhood she called home. Out here, her biggest worry was being eaten alive by mosquitoes. She could already see the distant lights of houses through the trees on the other side of the swamp, and she knew that soon she would come upon a side road or a lane, some street that led to those lights, to civilization, and a phone. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest. Such a small sound, yet it echoed off the trees like a drum. She froze, scanning the darkness for movement, wishing she'd borrowed her sister's little pink handgun before leaving on this trip. The peepers fell silent, the abrupt stillness far louder than their chorus of shrill chirps. Another crack. Somewhere nearby, the sudden flapping of a startled bird made her jump. Heart hammering in her chest, she peered into the dark tree line. A lone silhouette rose from the darkness, seeming to peel away from the swamp itself. 4 long, thin legs and a lean body. A head lifted and she felt eyes on her. For what felt like hours but was probably more like 2 seconds, she couldn't move. She stared at the strange shadow in the swamp until her mind was able to rationalize what she was looking at. She let out a whooshing breath of relief and felt her heart start beating again. For fuck's sake, she told herself, it's just a deer, calm down. In an instant, she felt a relief melt away as she watched the silhouette slowly rise onto 2 legs, silently ascending to twice its original height in one fluid movement. Its shoulders rolled back, long arms unfurled at its side, and she realized it had hands. This wasn't an animal. The creature standing before her now had the unmistakable outline of a person. For a long time, it did not move. It just stood there staring at her. The only sound was her own shuddering breath. Gone was any hint of the summer wildlife that had been so loud only moments before. She was suddenly very aware of just how far away the lights on those houses were. Hello? Her voice sounded breathy, frightened. She didn't know what she would do if the figure answered. What sort of person would be out here in the swamp at this time of night? Maybe he's just fishing? She thought hopefully. Its head cocked to one side at the sound of her voice. My car broke down, she babbled nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured at the distant houses. I'm just trying to get to a phone. The figure seemed to quiver as she spoke. It let out a small grunt, its head dipping toward her slightly before rolling onto the other side. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt whatever you're doing. What was wrong with her? Why was she explaining herself? Stop talking to the weirdo in the swamp, shut up, and start running, dumbass. Long fingers twitched erratically at its side as it watched her quietly. You look busy. I'll just leave you alone. She took a step back, willing her feet to run, but she couldn't make her legs spring into action. She couldn't bring herself to break eye contact with the figure for fear that as soon as she looked away, it might move. At her sudden movement, its head snapped upright, and its body stiffened. She froze as it let out a low growl. Its shoulders hunched, and it sank into a crouch. What the... She took a step back, and then another. Before she could turn and run, it let out a piercing bark like the frenzied cry of a fox and launched itself at her. She glimpsed pale eyes in the moonlight as it descended upon her, and her screams drowned in a wet symphony of tearing flesh and popping bone. They were carried off on the breeze as it slid through the rustling branches, gradually replaced with a discordant chorus of frogs and summer cicadas. Well, if that's the way it had to be, then there was no other choice. He had a strong will. He couldn't, though, fight against the need for self-preservation. Freezing, naked, chained to the tree near the edge of the marsh forest, he looked up at the November gloom-rumbled sky and wanted to tell it that he was sorry. The scream started in his stomach up to his chest, and then his lips, and then his skin split, spraying a blood ichor out in small bursts as claws, muscles, fur, fangs, ears all took the place of his mortal shroud. He pulled the chain with such explosive force it cut the tree in half. Then he bit off the shackles and pounce-loped into the mire. "It's happened again," the old man said at the tavern. "Someone get words to the sisters, and hurry." "What?" a younger man near him asked over a sip of beer. "The mire! There's a monster loose! Get the sisters now before we're all dead!" What was he supposed to do? Everyone left him behind, turned on him. His wife had gotten sick and died. He had no money for medicine. Then his cat and his horse had started to starve. So he stole, got arrested, didn't want anyone else to get hurt. When he got free, the only other things that cared if he lived or died were dead. A storm had knocked down part of the tree, and it had ruined his roof. His house flooded with leaves and water. In the end, all he wanted to do was die. So he'd gone to the graveyard to seek shelter in the mausoleum his wife had been placed in, along with her family. But he got caught again, and imprisoned. They said he must be in league with demons because he hadn't been sick. His household had all died, and now he was seeking to rob graves. So they stripped him, beat him, and chained him to a tree, circling his area with salt and hex marks, so that he'd starve to death under an open sky, the way you would kill someone possessed with a demon, they had said. They were in error. It wasn't a demon that was chained inside him. It was much worse. The mix of a tiger and a man and a wolf. In their foolishness, in their attempt at imprisonment, they had let out a scourge. At one point, perhaps the legend of what a were creature was got muddied. Or maybe no one who saw one was alive anymore. When it hit the village, it stunned everyone who thought they knew what it was. It was not tall, it was giant, nearer to 10 foot tall than 7. It was misshapen, like you'd expect something that was wretched mix of animal parts to be. It swiped a horse in half. The nails it had were more like scythes. Its upright dog body crashed through the side of the church. Door? What are doors when you can literally crash through buildings like a bully brother would a sandcastle? It threw a wagon on top of the general store. The only thing that kept everyone from death was that it was so big the little people could run and hide. Its flaring wolf nostrils would smell you. Its mottled brown tiger-striped ears would hear you. It mashed the marshal into a pile of gore and shoveled it into a mouth that looked like it was lined with pickaxes. He had been a man holding in something terrible that ate away at him for a lifetime. The kneeling monk could not contain the beast anymore, so he had his revenge. Who would blame him for his hate? Killed, slashed, ate, destroyed, terrorized, just like those with his curse had before. When the sisters finally arrived and investigated, when they caught sight of his terrible silhouette on the wet, cold, dreary edge of the swamp, his story and song played in their heads. He howled in rage, sadness, despair, and loneliness from his perch as their midnight king. If he wanted to, he could annihilate their whole homeland, and what would they do? The sisters wept at how poorly a hurt, misunderstood creature had been treated in life, and so they prayed for the last of the living dead, huddled together in the rain as the Wulftigre disappeared into the darkness. There are still stories told of horrendous, unearthly hallows that come from the edge of the swamps. Screams, tales of men, women, beasts, killed who venture too close. The other frightening tales that in his moment of enraged weakness, in letting the beast out, he set forth a beacon to other creatures of darkness. His shame and guilt made him fight with them out there in the lonely cold. Nightmare creatures pursuing him forever, a portal to hell itself, locked in a struggle until they finally dragged him under the rotting murk. This is why we pray, Junie. The prayer to the last of the living dead this time of year. Some say you and your sister are related to him. Thunder roared as the rain beat down on the roof of the tavern. Flynn finished his beer. So's keep your snickering to yourself when the old folk light their candles. He slapped down 2 coppers and pulled the hood up over his head and left into the dreary autumn storm. Imagine all 7.7 billion people on Earth stop everything they're doing. Imagine the clouds swirling, creating a vortex simultaneously all over the world. Imagine the light peeking through it, so warm, so golden, so pure. And then, suddenly, everything was right. It came so swiftly and left just as quick. Barren lands, now fertile, the water was cleaned, the air was freshened, like a new beginning for Earth. And oh, the celebration, the sweet, sweet celebration of being saved. Suddenly, each act of war was put on hold. Every battle, every negotiation was paused to celebrate this second chance. Forests that were burned were now green and standing tall. Bodies of water were clear, healthy, and full of life. The coral reef had color again. The air was pure, not a trace of toxic gases. It was truly like paradise to see all that had been destroyed, restored. But it didn't stop there. Once again, the vortex of clouds reformed, and everyone stopped waiting for the next miracle. There was a faint chirping sound, one that had not been present before. A bird. An unknown bird. Except it wasn't unknown, as it was quickly identified as endangered. Officials rushed to the zoos, explorers raced to the forest and jungles. Oceanographers quickly started their machines, and they were back. Thousands of endangered species back in their habitat like they never left. Like they were never hunted. Like their homes were never destroyed. Like they were all healthy. This new entity, this miracle, it has heard humanity's cry for help, for a way to reverse the damage inflicted upon the planet, and it has listened. But it was cut short. As the vortex reappeared, a voice came with it, projecting its message to everyone, everywhere, in every language.
I know I've been given a name, God, Allah, Zeus, and many, many others. Believe what you will, you are all correct. And there is indeed a paradise, heaven, nirvana, Dhyan, moksha, and there is a place for each of you. I have repaired your damaged home, but I cannot fix it completely.
The entire world held its breath as the vortex said its final sentence.
Earth must have time to flourish once more. Come, join me in paradise.
And then, it began. Death, everywhere. Suicides, thousands, no, millions, billions of them. Parents killing their own kids and then themselves. People jumping from bridges. Blood spatter from a gun. Tubs filled with warm red water. Ropes had never been sold so quickly before, and the cleaning supplies were wiped from the shelves. The streets ran red with blood. Bodies were piled at the base of buildings. Corpses hung with their eyes bulging, and the children, so many children, lying in their beds, sitting in chairs, foam at the mouth, veins bulging, eyes glassy. Everyone, everywhere was dying. Some chose quick death. Some chose painful ones. Some took their own lives. Some took others' lives. But it didn't matter. They were happy. Each and every person dying with a single thought in their mind. Paradise. But the happiest of them all, no human could match such joy. No. Because he sat on his throne, as each and every new soul appeared. And then the screams, the awful screams, the screams filled with such pain and misery echoed all throughout the dark, fiery pit. Ominous warning signs were everywhere. "Seek shelter," they exhorted in large, bold lettering. Added to light poles, traffic signs, and displayed on the sides of prominent buildings, they attracted a great deal of attention. Like most people who saw them, I had no idea what was going on. My immediate reaction was to look skyward for a quick glance at the weather. Unfortunately, it bore no hint of an upcoming tempest. I checked the weather app on my phone. It also failed to explain the cause for alarm. I saw the shared look of confusion on others around me. Whatever malady awaited, it appeared that most of us were blissfully unaware. There was some comfort in knowing they were just as ignorant, but I still wanted to know what was about to happen. It occurred to me that it might be some publicity stunt or a doomsday cult implying that the end is near. The signs themselves were sturdy and well made. That detracted a little bit from my religious cult theory. Their urgency to stir up an immediate panic wouldn't usually afford them enough time for professional-grade signage to be manufactured. The sheer volume and quality of these signs suggested organization and considerable patience. A web search revealed identical warnings displayed in several other places, all with equally mysterious origins and unknown meanings. There were even some speculation blogs discussing them. I skimmed a number of these discussion threads and realized the commenters had no more of an idea of the truth than I did. It was a pure guessing game. The authorities I spoke with had a grim assessment of the unknown entities who placed them throughout the city without official sanction or apparent need. It was viewed as a probable hoax, but the very nature of warning signs were considered a potential threat. It had to be taken seriously and investigated, but the public policy was to downplay the whole thing as a prank. I found it interesting that no one seemed to witness the signs being erected. That alone would have taken a large team to accomplish. How was it that no one noticed them being placed in strategic locations? When I pointed this out on one of the web's speculation threads, it was immediately deleted. I felt like that was very telling. I tried several more times with exactly the same result. Whoever put up the mystery signs were also able to delete my posts. That meant they also had control over the local social media threads. An infinitely larger conspiracy was developing in my head. I tried sharing my thoughts on the matter elsewhere, with much the same result. There was definitely an aggressive effort behind the scenes to silence my rising speculation. I surmised that others were probably being censored in the same way, but I had no means of verifying it. As if everything wasn't strange enough, the message on the signs suddenly changed. They went from saying, "Seek shelter," to "Danger, stay alert." It was the exact same signs from before, and none of them were electronic. They were old-school signs made out of conventional materials. Not only had a secret team of scofflaws erected the original ones without being seen, but now they'd managed to change them to a new message without attracting notice. It was baffling, and more than a little bit spooky. The handful of people I managed to engage about the odd phenomenon were either disinterested or hadn't even noticed. I think I was almost as alarmed by their newfound apathy as I was over the impressive feat of the signs being changed unseen. I drove around town hoping to catch one of the unknown pranksters in the act, but all of them were already switched over to the new phrase. Whatever their purpose for the elaborate effort, it was impressive to witness from an organizational standpoint. It definitely intrigued me to investigate further. Without any other options, I pulled over to the roadside and examined one of them up close. It had an ordinary galvanized steel post buried deep in the ground, with a couple of bolts affixing the reading surface to the rod. The large letters were embossed into the metal like an oversized license plate, painted bright white to contrast with the familiar green background color. Honestly, it looked like official signage information you'd see from the road department. The back bore little identification, other than a strange sticker that said, "Think, I know you can do it." I was taken aback by that. It didn't seem like it belonged. As strange as it might have seemed, it appeared to be personal. I was in deep thought as I pondered its possible meaning while walking back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for several moments in deep concentration. I searched my thoughts and tried to make sense of it all. To my disbelief, the very sign I had examined intently now bore a brand new message. "You are very close. Keep going." It didn't make sense. I was right there. I would have seen any person take down the previous message, and yet somehow it had been changed before my very eyes. I started to get back out to figure out how they had switched the sign when my seatbelt wouldn't let go. I pressed the release button a dozen times. It felt like it was determined to stop me from getting up. The harder I pressed on it, the more it resisted my efforts. I became restless and agitated. I fought hard to escape the restraint, but it was impossible to break free. Looking up, I saw the sign was once again revised. I was totally befuddled. It wasn't possible, but I saw it with my own eyes. You are on the home stretch, Brian. Wake up. The sign itself began to fade. The roadside in my car disappeared completely from view. I found myself surrounded by loving, familiar faces that I couldn't immediately place. My thoughts were filled with all the vivid colors and scents that I was suddenly aware of, lingering in the air. I struggled to rise up and make sense of it all. The unexpected transformation took my breath away. You've been in a coma, Brian. Your body is weak from inactivity. Don't try to sit up yet, okay? We have you temporarily restrained for your own safety until you were back with us. We had the idea to try a radical new technique to help you come out of it. Dr. Reynolds gave you a series of hypnotic suggestions and signs to decipher. It looks like you were able to follow his clues back to lucidity. This is so amazing. Welcome back. In my tortured ears there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a faint, distant baying as of some gigantic hound. It is not dream, it is not, I fear, even madness. For too much has already happened to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mangled corpse. I alone know why, and such is my knowledge that I am about to blow my brains out, for fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down unlit and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps the black, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate. Wearied with the commonplace of a prosaic world, where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grow stale, St. John and I followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites all were ours in their time. But each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could hold us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Heisman were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally there remained for us only the most direct stimuli of unnatural personal experience and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course which even in my present fear I mention with shame and timidity. That hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorred practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalog even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantsless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, where with the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi, we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged daemons carven of basalt and onyx vomited from wide grinning mouths weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death, the lines of red carnal things hand in hand woven in voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odors our mood most craved. Sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined Eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful, soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with comely, lifelike bodies, perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyard of the world. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes, and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There, one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen, and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. Statues and paintings there were, all of fiendish subjects and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio bound in tanned human skin held certain unknown and unnameable drawings which it was rumored Goya had perpetrated, but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed, brass, and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonance of exquisite morbidity and cacodemonical ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tomb loot ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot in particular that I must not speak. Thank God I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details a fastidious technical care. An inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous, grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate. St. John was always the leader, and he it was who led the way at last to that mocking, that accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was the dark rumor and legendry, the tales of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scenes in these final moments, the pale, autumnal moon over the graves, casting long, horrible shadows, the grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass, and the crumpling slabs, the vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon, the antique ivied church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky, the phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner, the odors of mold, vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamp and seas, and worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry, for he whom we sought had centuries before been found in this self-same spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remembered how we delved in the ghoul's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange, half-heard, directionless baying of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold, and beheld a rotting oblong box crusted with mineral deposits from the long undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the things that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull and its long firm teeth and its eyeless sockets that had once glowed with a carnal fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound, or sphinx with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression on its features was repellent in the extreme, savoring at once a death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John nor I could identify, and at the bottom, like a marker seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it. That this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines had been unfamiliar, we would have desired it. But as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature, which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, the ghastly sole symbol of the corpse-eating cult of inaccessible Lang in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologist, lineaments he wrote drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from that abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So, too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background, but the autumn wind moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone, and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of visitors. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large, opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it, and another time we thought we heard whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination alone. That same curiously disturbed imagination which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we had heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned strangely scented candles before it. We read much in Al-Hazred's Necronomicon about its properties and about the relation of ghoul souls to the object it symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then, terror came. On the night of September 24, 19, I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. When I aroused St. John from his sleep, he professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was that night that the faint, distant baying over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air and heard as if receding far away a queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized with the blackest of apprehensions that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror and fascination. Mostly we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess, and every night the demonic baying rolled over the windswept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29, we found in the soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November 18, when St. John, walking home after dark from the distant railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear the whir of wings and see a vague, black, cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper, "The amulet, that damned thing." Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens, and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demonic sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And when I saw on the dim-lit moor a wide, nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground. When I arose, trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisance before the enshrined amulet of the green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet, after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights, I heard the baying again, and before a week was over, I felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind stronger than the night wind rushed by, and I knew that what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day, I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent, sleeping owner I knew not, but I felt that I must at least try any step conceivably logical. What the hound was and why it pursued me were questions still vague, but I had first heard the baying in that ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whispers, had served to connect the curse with the stealing of this amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair when, at an inn in Rotterdam, I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of the nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night above the usual clamor of drunken voices a faint, deep, insistent note as of a gigantic hound. So at last, I stood again in that unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows, and leafless trees dropped sullenly to meet the withered, frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivy church pointing a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over-frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated, and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats, which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither, unless to pray, or gibber out insane pleas and apologize to the calm white thing that lay within. But whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside of myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption, when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth until I killed him with the blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouched within that centuried coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy, sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed, not clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with phosphorescent sockets and sharp, ensanguined fangs, yawning twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep, sardonic bay as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claws the lost and fateful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed and ran away idiotically, my screams soon dissolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rides the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses, dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats from night-black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed web wings circle closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable.